announcement of, and a conversation about its 2020 Catholic Newsmaker of the Year. I'm Heidi Schlumpf, NCR's executive editor. I'm joined today by 3 guests, 2 of whom are here and one of whom who's having some technical difficulties and hopefully will be joining us shortly. Our first guest is Michael Sean Winters. He's NCR's political columnist and a member of the editorial board that selected this year's Newsmaker of the Year. Michael.
Hello.
Christopher White is NCR's national correspondent, and he's joining us from New York City. Welcome, Chris.
Thanks, Heidi. Great to be with you all.
And our third guest is Mark Kennedy Shriver. He's president of Save the Children Action Network and author of 2 books, including Pilgrimage, My Search for the Real Pope Francis. So Mark is having technical difficulties, but we hope he's going to be able to join us at some point during our event. So,
can you hear me at all, or am I not on?
Oh, I do hear you. There he is. Hi, Mark.
Hi, Mark.
Sorry. Sorry, everyone. I apologize. I know I'm late. I'm having some problems, but here we are. Thank you for having me.
Well, great. Just an overview for those who are listening. I'm going to shortly announce our Newsmaker of the Year, and then each of our guests will have a chance to comment on the choice. And after some follow-up questions from me, we will take questions from viewers. So if you have questions for any of our guests, please put them in the comments section, and the behind-the-scenes people will get them to me. So just some background. The National Catholic Reporter has been recognizing a prominent Catholic since 2010, when the editors decided to honor Sister Carol Keehan, then of the Catholic Health Association, for her leadership and courage in helping to pass healthcare reform. Since then, NCR has recognized Catholic men, women, and once a couple. They've included a pope, a Supreme Court justice, a peace activist, an embattled theologian, and a sex abuse whistleblower, among others. After 6 years, the editors skipped a year and came back the following year, changing the name of the distinction from Catholic of the Year to Newsmaker of the Year. This indicates that we're not judging somebody's Catholicity, but rather his or her newsworthiness. That year, it was former Cardinal Theodore McCarrick. I'm happy to say that this year's recipient is someone the editors feel positive about. It's someone who has reintroduced decency into the highest office in the land. He is also someone who not only practices his faith, but someone for whom Catholicism has shaped his personal and professional life. Our editorial, which will be posted right after this Facebook Live event, says, if the United States is still a democracy 100 years from now, it will be, at least in part, thanks to this person. NCR's Catholic Newsmaker of the Year for 2020 is our nation's second Catholic president, President-elect Joe Biden. So, Michael, you were part of the selection process. Why did the editors choose President-elect Biden, and who were some of the other possible choices?
I think the nomination of him for this spoke for itself, and I think in 2 regards. First of all, he did something very remarkable. Beating an incumbent president is a very hard thing to do, even with this incredible pandemic that has afflicted the country. As much as I think it's an open question if Biden could have won without the pandemic. On the other hand, he had to mount a campaign in the middle of a pandemic. I mean, if you've ever worked on a campaign, it's as often the conversations over the smoke breaks that is where the important stuff gets done, or over the cold pizza, and none of that happened. And so they put it together. He found ways to communicate. And I think what and the quote you had from the editorial mentioned this. What really shone through to the voters was his decency, his kind of normalcy in terms of politics, a kind of core concern with competence and veracity, and the things that we all kind of assumed were important in a democracy, but didn't realize how vital they were until their absence made them, these last 4 years, made them stand in relief. but he knocked off an incredibly interesting group of Democratic opponents to get the nomination, faced an incumbent, and won in a way without that was very true to himself. And I think as a Catholic newsmaker, he ran very much as a Catholic. Unlike John Kerry, the last Catholic to run, he was comfortable talking about his faith. He invoked core Catholic concepts like human dignity and the common good that are not exclusively Catholic, obviously, but that resonate with the Catholic tradition. So I don't think it was really a tough call for us. There were a couple. Someone suggested Tony Fauci, the Catholic healthcare worker, but Biden was the obvious choice.
Yes, and I think the Black Lives Matters protesters were also part of the conversation as well. Chris, you wrote a profile about President-elect Biden back when he was running that talked about his Catholic background. Tell us, how important is his Catholicism?
Well, Heidi, I'll actually just quote from the president-elect himself when he was once asked about it, and he said, "It's who I am." He answered it, just in very simple terms like that. And I think that's manifested itself in symbolic ways that we've all seen, such as his regular attendance at Mass, that we've seen week after week now for months on end, his carrying his rosary. Those are all symbolic ways in which it's been pretty obvious that he's a Catholic candidate, and now the second Catholic president in U.S. history. But it's also been very evident in substantive ways, too. I mean, the way in which he talks about the dignity of work, the way in which he sees politics as oriented toward the common good, you can't really disentangle that from his faith. It's just sort of baked in there with it. And I think we've seen that on the campaign trail, and I think we're going to see that in the Oval Office over the next 4 years, because you can't talk about Joe Biden and make sense of who he is and his identity without his faith.
Thank you, Chris. Mark, your uncle was the first Catholic president, and this was 60 years ago. And now you were part of the Catholics for Biden group that supported Biden's campaign. Can you talk a little bit about any similarities or differences you see in Biden being the second Catholic president?
Making sure you can hear me. Is that okay? It is. All right, great. I'm sorry again for the technical foul up here. I think, as you said, it was 60 years ago that President Kennedy became president. And there's a lot that's changed over those 60 years. I mean, if you contextualize where Kennedy was in leading up to his election, a lot of people thought that he was going to take orders from the Pope. And there was that real sense that an American Catholic's first allegiance was going to be to the Pope. And I don't hear that conversation at all in this campaign. As you mentioned, I was one of the co-chairs of Catholics for Biden. I felt a huge amount of energy across the country in conversations that I had with the campaign with Catholics who were energized about his vision of decency, of humility, of a commitment to faith, and across other faiths as well, our Jewish brothers and sisters, Muslims, folks of all faiths, all Christian denominations across the country. We're proud of the fact that this was a guy who went to Mass on a regular basis, but more importantly, realized that he was a flawed human being, that he needed, God's mercy, that he understood words like preferential option for the poor, that he understood that when Pope Francis talked about a poor church for the poor, that this was something that was part of Catholic doctrine, and he wasn't going to shy away from it. I mean, I talked a couple of stories in the article I wrote that I was honored to have published in your newspaper, and it's really about the fact that he does small things with a lot of love. I mean, I know that it sounds like St. Teresa, but he does ordinary things with extraordinary love. He showed up at my mother and father's funeral, didn't ask to speak, went in and out the side doors. And you'd say, well, my folks were big shots, had no time for 40. That's true. These other small gestures he did. I did an event and introduced him to a friend of ours whose son has developmental differences. And Vice President Biden called him up, he called the parents up at 11 o'clock that night after the event was over. And he had focused on that young man for a good 5 minutes while everybody wanted to take pictures and take selfies, and he focused on that young man. And then he called the parents up at 11 o'clock at night and told them what a great job they had done with their son. So I think he, as we heard, is Catholic, is proud of being Catholic. And I think the article that you wrote, the editorial you wrote, is fantastic. I'm so honored you gave me a quick glimpse of it beforehand. I encourage everybody to go read it because it's a great piece of writing and it's spot on.
Thank you, Mark. We're getting a lot of comments in the comment area, and just a reminder to people, if you have questions for our guests, you can put those in the chat and they will get to me. I have a couple follow-up questions myself. Back to you, Michael. Not all Catholics are going to be excited about our pick. We're seeing a lot of enthusiasm in the comments here today, but at least half of U.S. Catholics did not vote for Biden. Will he be able to overcome some of the polarization in the country and indeed in the church?
I think the short answer is no. The country is enormously polarized. And I think it's become obvious that many of the polarities in the church actually flow from the political divisions. That Americans go into the public square as Democrats and Republicans first, and then try to cherry pick their religious tradition for quotes and arguments that will bolster their political choices. That said, I think he ran a campaign. He never said this explicitly, but all last year I called attention to some research by Lee Drutman that pointed out that we say, oh, is somebody a progressive or a centrist, or a progressive or an establishmentarian? And he said, there's a really important second question, which is, are they progressive on economic issues or on social issues? And it turns out like over a quarter of the country is progressive on economic issues, but somewhat conservative on social issues. But the reverse of people who are progressive on social issues, but kind of fiscally conservative, it's only about 4%. So the kind of Howard Schultz, Mike Bloomberg position is kind of like 4% of the population. And the other is 28% of the population, what I call the Pope Francis voters. And if you go back to the Democratic Convention, although, Biden is pro-choice. I wish he wasn't. There's no way around it. I wish he had a more nuanced position on abortion. That said, we had 4 days of a Democratic National Convention where the word abortion was not mentioned once. And that was pretty remarkable if you think of some of the more recent conventions and the prominence for pro-choice activists. So that won't be enough to satisfy the real pro-life activists. But I hope they listen to that nuance and how important that is, that he may be able to he's not going to change the Democratic Party into a pro-life party in the sense of opposing liberal abortion laws. But if Democrats learn to not lead with the cultural issues, they really have a chance to reach out to the center of the electorate and become a governing coalition for a generation. And I think the post-COVID economic mess is going to be such, he really needs to do that. So we'll see. That's help.
Thank you, Michael. We have a commenter who's asking if one of you, and I'm going to ask you, Chris, if you'll take this one, might be willing to comment on the different ways that the U.S. Bishops' Conference welcomed, I think, with quotes, Biden's election compared to Trump's. And maybe you could also comment a little bit, Chris, on what effect you think Biden's Catholicism might have on the U.S. church.
Sure. So, when President Trump was elected in 2016, the U.S. bishops issued a press release sort of congratulating him. When the AP called the election for Biden, they did the exact same thing. The major difference this time around, of course, is that when the U.S. bishops met last month for their General Assembly, at the very end of a period of 2 days after meetings, right at the very end, they announced that they would be forming a working group to discuss what Biden's Catholicism meant for Catholics in this country. They specifically cited his position on abortion and also LGBT rights, saying that because those differ with that of the church, it causes confusion among some Catholics. In talking to a number of bishops, folks that work at the Bishops' Conference, there is this general concern from a number of folks that there is this posture by some members of the hierarchy that because they don't agree on every single issue, that it's going to be this sort of posture of unwelcome and unwillingness to work together. That being said, a lot of Catholic bishops are saying there are great things that we can do together. Look at the Pope's priorities: climate change, migration, ending the death penalty. These are all boxes that Biden ticks for us. And if we sort of squander that opportunity, a lot can be lost here. So I think we're going to have a very uneasy relationship, at least when it comes to Biden's relationship with the top of the U.S. Bishops' Conference. That being said, Cardinal Wilton Gregory, the Archbishop of Washington, D.C., has said that he wants to work with Biden. He says, I'm here to dialogue with him, and I welcome him. I'm not going to deny him communion or do any of the things that some of the folks on the extreme Catholic right are calling for. So what will his, having a Catholic president, what's that going to mean for the U.S. Catholic Church? Everyone should be subscribing to NCR because it's going to be great for the news business. I think, there's just going to be in the same way in which Biden was talking about the Pope on the campaign trail, I think we can see more of that in the office. I think he's made clear that people of faith are going to be listened to. He may not always agree to them, but they're going to have a seat at the table in his White House, and that's something we should all be paying attention to and be glad for.
Thank you, Chris. Yeah, it remains to be seen if we're going to be having wafer wars again over whether Biden can receive communion. And if you haven't been to ncronline.org today yet, you might want to go check out our main story today by Chris. Is a story that kind of looks at where might Biden go to church when he is in Washington, D.C. So Chris has kind of profiled some of the parishes near the White House. Mark, in your piece that you wrote for us during the campaign, you talked about Biden as just a good, decent person who can care for all Americans. Could you tell us a little bit more about what your personal experiences have been with the president-elect and why you see him as a good, decent Catholic?
Yeah, yes. And if I could just jump in on the last question, I think there's so much that a Biden presidency has in common with church teaching than there is that differentiates it. And I think if we spend the next 4 years worrying about one or two issues or get, enamored with whether, some bishop refuses to give him communion, we're going to lose a huge opportunity to bring the country together. I mean, we just heard about all of things that are aligned between the Biden philosophy and the Biden platform and what the Catholic Church teaches. And I think people are tired of, this division and separation and, Republicans and Democrats and gays and straights and North and South. And I mean, I wish the church and our political leader would try to figure out what we have in common. And you see, efforts out, Cardinal Gregory here in DC and others saying, let's sit down, let's have a conversation, which is exactly what the Pope has asked us to do. And it's just crazy that we spend so much time trying to figure out how to separate ourselves and how to cause consternation and dwell on the one or two issues that we can common. I agree they ought to subscribe to NCR, ought to read it because it's got a great perspective. Having said all that, my father, when he ran vice president, the last stop he made the campaign trail in 1970, which didn't end so well. But the last stop was in Delaware for a young man running for Senate. Biden, claims that Dad gave a great speech and fired everybody up, and he won by just a few votes, and credits my father with helping him get over the finish line. Joe Biden's kind of been in our lives ever since. Just 8 years old, don't remember that, although my sister Maria went on that trip and does remember meeting then, Joe before he became U.S. Senator. And I think, he's just consistently been there fighting for healthcare with Uncle Ted Kennedy, Senator Kennedy. He's been there fighting for issues around gun control, the important issues, and he's helped my mother spread Special Olympics all around the world. Dr. Biden, his wife, I know really well. Their children played lacrosse, and so I spent a lot of time on the sidelines with Dr. Biden and their family, and they're just a good, decent family. I mean, I don't really. It's not glamorous, but they're not going to embarrass us. but more importantly, they're going to lead with decency. They're going to, do what they think. Is he going to make mistakes? Of course he is. Is he perfect? As your editorial beautifully said, he's not perfect. And he realizes he needs mercy, and he realizes he needs to go to confession. I mean, his predecessor talked about never having to go to, reconciliation. I mean, we're all sinners here. And I think that these little gestures he makes, his first trip as vice president was to the Special Olympics International Games out west. And we sat on the tarmac. I was honored to be on that plane, sat on the tarmac for hours and hours. People were advising him not to go, cancel the trip. It's no big deal. It was supposed to be a day hop. And he said, I gave my word, I'm going to go. And we went all the way across the country to Idaho. He spent a couple hours on the ground. The athletes from all around the world were thrilled to see him. We turned around and flew all the way home and got home late on that night. And he went to work the next day. But that's just symbolic of the type of guy that I think we're going to see in the White House. Someone who keeps his word, who understands loyalty, who understands the importance of faith in God and humility. And that's what that's why I've wanted to work for him 2 years ago. He's a good guy.
Thank you, Mark. What a contrast to what we've been experiencing the last 4 years. And people who were listening closely might have heard you refer to Dr. Jill Biden, using her title, doctor. Does Michael, would you like to comment at all, or on some of the small references that Joe Biden does that kind of put Catholicism out there in the square? So the mention of on eagle's wings, the quoting of St. Francis, the showing up to Mass on the holy day of obligation. What's the meaning behind that? The media seems pretty enamored with that.
Here is the one area where I do see a certain congruence with Mark's uncle, the President Kennedy, where President Kennedy, the first Mass that most Americans saw was his funeral Mass. They had not been inside a Catholic church. That was at St. Matthew's Cathedral, which is where I worshiped for many years. It's a beautiful space. It was Cardinal Cushing, whose Latin was completely indecipherable, but the music was beautiful. You had all the pageantry. It was really remarkable to me last week on Tuesday, the Feast of the Immaculate Conception. The report from the pool report from covering the president-elect said, we're getting ready to go. They have not given us the destination, but we believe it's church because today is, for Catholics, is the Feast of the Immaculate Conception. And you were realizing, like, the person, whoever was the pool reporter, I'd forgotten, wasn't Catholic, didn't know, so there's going to be this kind of interesting education about Catholic practice coming from the man who is now the most prominent Catholic. The reason I don't think that will necessarily translate into overcoming polarization is for conservative Catholics, that will make them crazy. Because the bishops who don't like Biden, who are the one issue abortion bishops, to them, it's a reproach to them. Like, here's this guy who goes to Mass every Sunday. He doesn't miss holy days. And they couldn't keep him in lockstep with their agenda. It makes them crazy. I mean, now I think there are cardinals like Cardinal Gregory in Washington, Cardinal O'Malley in Boston, Cardinal Supich in Chicago, who are not culture warriors. Cardinal Tobin in Newark, who I think are with the Pope and say, look, we have to concern about, have a wider frame of social concern. They're pro-life, obviously, but they have a wider understanding to that. So I think he will figure out real quickly who to work with. Unfortunately, this bureaucracy that the church has in Washington at the bishops' conference is not in the hands of the Pope Francis bishops. And so they've got to figure out ways to work around that.
Thank you. Would anyone like to follow up on that or comment? We have another question about Biden's cabinet picks so far. So I think we saw today that he's, go ahead, Mark.
I would just add, if members of the church hierarchy want to stay focused on one issue, they're going to lose the people in the pews. I mean, just my own personal opinion, but I think there's so much that people want to come together and work on, and there are real issues out there. There are people in food lines. There are children that are falling behind academically. There's just so many, there's homelessness out there with our veterans, with people of all backgrounds. There's so much that we could work on together that if, quote, the church hierarchy focused on that, people would be coming back into the pews instead of going in the opposite direction.
Thank you. Chris, you want any closing comments about some of the Catholicism of Biden, and any mention of which church you think he's going to be attending, maybe in DC?
Well, to answer your first question that you mentioned a moment ago about Biden's cabinet, what we're seeing is a very Catholic cabinet shaping up as well. Folks like John Kerry as Biden's point person on climate change, Javier Becerra as the Attorney General, is a Catholic. Dennis McDonough, who was President Obama's White House Chief of Staff, has two brothers in the priesthood, very Catholic, who told me this summer, Joe Biden is a man who is not very far from prayer. So we're going to see that in big ways and small. As to where some of that prayer might be taking place, we know this is a man who really enjoys the Jesuits. He enjoys the fact that there's a Jesuit Pope in Rome. So I think Holy Trinity in Georgetown, where he often attended as vice president, will be very happy to have him. That's where my bet is, but I think we're going to see him pop up all around DC.
We're coming towards the end of our time, but I want to definitely thank everyone who joined us here today. And thank you to all of today's guests and to our behind the scenes folks, Stephanie Diego and Brittany Wilmes, who helped produce our event. To read the editorial in which we name our Newsmaker of the Year for 2020, please go to NCR Online. You can also follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. We thank you again for joining us. Have a great end of your Advent, and have a Merry Christmas and Happy New Year.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.